joining me from the nation's capital. Welcome back. It's Margaret Brennan. She is, of course, host of CBS's Face the Nation with Margaret Brennan. We have had you on repeatedly on times where I want hand-holding and to go around the world. And as a continuation, Margaret is a veteran journalist. We had her live in Charlottesville back in May of 2023, and she talked about her first days leaving UVA and becoming a Cub reporter and production assistant at the Louis Rukeyser show. She went on to CNBC, where we first crossed paths, Bloomberg TV, where we did TV together, and then, of course, has covered herself in glory for a decade and a half at CBS News. Does that encompass it?
Just about, yeah. That was so much fun down in Charlottesville, one of my favorite places to be.
Yes, I know they love you over there, but I got to tell you that since we did cross paths at Bloomberg, I think back, my mind is taken back to 15 years ago where you were the point person at the company covering the Arab Spring, and we were covering the situation in Cairo, in Damascus, of course. And the first thing I thought about is I think I saw you and the new leader of Syria. What would you have thought while all of that was happening with Bashar Assad and it was a bloody, bloody civil war? And the next thing you know, like split screen, Margaret, let's look into this crystal ball. A former Al-Qaeda type militant is sitting in the Oval Office with the President Donald Trump after Syria has been freed.
No.
How would you have processed that?
I have a hard time processing it now. I mean, I think of Ahmed al-Shara, the president of Syria, who was this leader of a group called HTS that had in the past Al-Qaeda ties. Before that, he had ties to some of the founders of ISIS. He was the unlikeliest of unifying leaders that would be sitting across from a president of the United States. I mean, he spent nearly 6 years in U.S. military custody. And it's mind-blowing. His life is like a movie. He's been meeting with King Charles, the president of France,
Putin, Estonia. It's kind of mind-blowing.
It's incredible, but it shows you the trajectory of change is just not something you can expect, because if you look just a few years ago, and I'm talking like Biden administration, like very near recent history, this was declared the bad guys won, right? That Bashar al-Assad, the autocratic leader of Syria, who had committed numerous war crimes against his own people, even using chemical weapons. If you remember, the U.S. came close to military intervention.
The Obama administration blinked.
Exactly.
I think it was in 2013 and was widely criticized for that.
He was. But by the way, no one rushed to the aid of the Syrian people, really, except for at least failed diplomatic deals. But we were looking around the world as countries like the UAE were normalizing relations with Bashar al-Assad. They're like, okay, you're a bad guy, but you won this war. And guess what? Then you have this lightning take of the Damascus capital by HTS, and Ahmed al-Shara is all of a sudden the leader, trying to unify the country and talking about trying to protect minorities.
Was that like a World War I kind of Gavrilo Princip Black Hand moment, like a tipping point? What happened was Russia so occupied with the misadventure in Ukraine that it could no longer fortify Assad. Assad gets on a flight, packs all of his stuff in his Lucre, and he goes to Moscow. And suddenly, it just happened all of a sudden. I remember in the autumn.
Right. That's correct. I mean, that's what we have been hearing in terms of the analysis. But in talking to the Biden administration officials in that moment, they were totally taken by surprise. Intelligence officials were not warning of this. The Turkish government might have been a little bit more aware, but the ability to have this upstart group of rebels who had been holding a small area of Syria turn themselves into a national force and take the country stunned the world. And it is because of what you say there, that their backers, the Russians in particular, were occupied elsewhere, so they weren't running in there with their air force to back up Bashar al-Assad. And the Iranians were also weakened because of what Israel and the United States, but Israel had done after October 7th to then go after Iran's proxy forces like Hezbollah. Hezbollah had provided on-the-ground troops to fight for Assad against the Syrian people. So you saw that weakening, and then all of a sudden it collapsed. And it was shocking. But to bring it back to what you asked about the Arab Spring and the start of this all, is this where people thought it would end up? No, but it was also something that people were ready to move on from. And it was very clear the Syrian people were not. It was very clear that this civil war, which is how Assad responded to those uprisings, war on his own people, that it led to so many other knock-on effects, the rise of ISIS, the flood of immigrants into Europe that changed their political process, right? That changed German politics, that destabilized in some way parts of Europe, all of it because of the inability of the Assad government to deliver for their own people and to listen to their own people and to try to crush a uprising by force. Like, it set off this incredible chain of events.
Margaret, I'm also, I'm reminded of the spirit of 2002, 2003, when the conventional wisdom really when I lived in New York was that if Iraq is liberated and Afghanistan's liberated, that it stands to reason that Iran will topple over, where there was a restive population. We know that the wisdom proved false. If anything, Iran was strengthened. It got a satellite in Syria. It strengthened its position in Libya. Of course, October 7th, not Libya, sorry, Syria. Of course, October 7th changed everything. What was the wisdom to start this campaign in Iran? Because again, from the exile community perspective was that these guys would bail. They'd take the money and run. They can't go to Syria anymore, but ostensibly Russia or other parts of the Iran-friendly, Shiite-friendly Middle East?
Well, the actions of October 7th by Hamas, which did get backing from Iran, with the terror attack that killed about 1,200 Israelis, brutal terror attack. It just underscores that even if you are the most well-equipped and resourced intelligence group in the region, the Israelis, and you have the backing of the most powerful military in the world, the United States, that you can't necessarily control for everything. And sometimes when you think you're in firm control, you are not. And that event so turned upside down the Israeli intelligence and military establishment and so many of their assumptions that they went with full force, as into Lebanon with further strikes against Hezbollah, another terror group and militia backed by Iran, and then ultimately to Tehran itself. And I remember on the morning after October 7th, asking the then Israeli ambassador on Face the Nation about that, saying, are you taking this fight to Tehran next? And that was when we were talking about, cross-border attacks from Gaza into Israel. So you have to lay out this chain of events where Netanyahu then looks like he wants to redeem himself for the security failures of his own state on one front, make up for it by going whole hog elsewhere, and then trying to persuade American presidents, as he tried to persuade Joe Biden and then Donald Trump, ultimately successfully persuaded Donald Trump to go in last June with those attacks on the 3 nuclear sites. And the U.S. hit the brakes there, saying, let's see what happens. Iran and the regime are weakened. We've hit these militias, their proxy forces. We've done all these things. Let's see what happens. You did see uprisings, right? You saw protests in the streets.
You saw a bloody crackdown after both President Trump and Bibi Netanyahu said the country will be yours for the taking. And I know there's only so much you could do without boots on the ground.
Exactly.
But there's this perception that everything that happened between January and the bombing and the killing of the Ayatollah Khamenei, that people there are being executed right now and they are being arrested, and there is a cleanup, and there's this fear that is it going to be abandonment like it was the Shiites after the job was not finished in Iraq in the early 90s, that they were rounded up and executed. This is such a parlous time. And yes, the war is now very much taken to Iran, and we're on tenterhooks if the crisis in Hormuz is going to escalate to another exchange of missiles and assassinations. But I'm still blown away that it has all led to this. Even when we were doing that live show in Charlottesville, the mood of that season was that things are unusually quiet in the occupied territories, or to think of the West Bank and Gaza and everything. And out of left field, seemingly, October 7th happens.
Well, I think it underscores that so many of these problems you may turn your attention away from, but it doesn't make them go away. And particularly with the Middle East, I can't tell you how many American presidents I've covered who have promised that they would look away from the Middle East towards Asia to get back to, that prime growing competitor, perhaps adversary to the United States. And time and again, because of our alliances in the Middle East, particularly to Israel, America feels compelled to step in. And in this case, President Trump ultimately was persuaded to, in a way that is clearly not been defined by the Trump administration as to what the end game is here. Because, as you put it, and Secretary Rubio testified to this to Congress, it is frighteningly effective when a government is willing to have snipers in the streets gun down their own people. If that's not a red line for you, and you are able to continue to get people to back your government up by doing horrific acts like this, then eventually maybe people stop rising up, or maybe people become more radicalized, or, there are so many other scenarios that could come out of that. But it clearly was an assumption of best case scenarios by the Israeli government and the Trump administration to say that the Iranian regime would fall suddenly because of the more recent strikes in Operation Epic Fury, as the president currently calls it. But it's a tremendous string of events. And, for as long as I've been covering this beat, Benjamin Netanyahu has been prime minister of Israel for such a large part of it, for over 20 odd years in that role. And he is finally seeing the project that he wanted to see carried out. Had that extraordinary interview with my colleague, Major Garrett, over the weekend on 60 Minutes, but he's not done with this war. Even if President Trump is saying he'd really like to find a way to extract the United States and have a negotiated settlement.
How do you find a way out of that as Trump? Like, in terms of finishing the job, wasn't he emboldened by this extraction of Nicolas Maduro in January? I mean, we had even taking out Manuel Noriega in the early 90s wasn't that clean. Did that potentially, from your sources in State and the Defense Department and the CIA, say that maybe there was an asset-light way of doing this in Iran? Maybe if you shell the place and do targeted executions, that it would just topple over. Again, there's been that conventional wisdom now for the better part of 48 years.
Well, I think the public messaging by the president of the United States is different from what was discussed by his national security advisors. You're referring to the president's remarks voicing concern about how brutal the regime was and is to its own people. We're not hearing that the U.S. military intervention has anything to do with human rights. We're not hearing anything about that, other than the president saying, we tried to get weapons. And it's not even clear what he means by that or who he got them to, but he says the Kurds didn't deliver them. Perhaps that's his excuse as to why there isn't an uprising. But we have dropped that from the president's to-do list, the idea of human rights. We had heard it was about a number of different things, including making up for nearly 50 years of Iranian bad behavior. But if that is the case, then why would you negotiate with the exact same regime that carried out that behavior, including the IRGC, which is now more firmly in control? And then we move on to the nuclear file, right? And then the missiles and the like. And for the Israeli government, as I understand it through our reporting, the argument and persuasion started earlier than that amazing New York Times report about the February 11th Situation Room conversation that ultimately was successful. But it went back to Mar-a-Lago in December and the beginning of the year, when Prime Minister Netanyahu was down there trying to talk to the president about really wanting to go finish off his concerns about the ballistic missiles in Iran. So it was targeting that in particular and that capability. So we keep getting different explanations as to what the intention was here. And this is where it's getting really politically tricky in Washington, because how do you find that off-ramp? Maybe if you don't define the goal, you can just say, hey, I succeeded and I achieved the goal I never defined for you. And that might be what President Trump is hoping for here. But the Strait of Hormuz is that complicating factor, because that's like a measurable, quantifiable thing that remains the main leverage point for Iran in a negotiation or militarily.
Full disclosure, I'm Roben Farzad. We are so happy to be joined again by Margaret Brennan. She's, of course, host of CBS's Face the Nation Sunday mornings with Margaret Brennan. She's covered the State Department, the White House. She's covered all manner of beats at CBS News for nearly a decade and a half. She and I crossed paths at Bloomberg News and Bloomberg TV. And then we even covered retail bankruptcies at CNBC together. That's
crazy.
Like a global financial crisis memory. To say all of which is to say that you're like, I've called you like an Inspector Gadget of coverage. You know, if you and I just wanted to wonk out on the Federal Reserve right now and inflation and everything, we could do that. But it's great to be able to go around the world with you. What exactly is happening? You talk about a balance of power with Iran and the UAE and Israel. That kind of came out of left field. The one that has borne the brunt of attacks from Iran, drone attacks, is the United Arab Emirates. It doesn't seem like that was a logical target in the past, but now that it's looked at effectively as a proxy of the United States and Israel, and of course they left OPEC, and they also have a front row seat to what is going on in the Strait of Hormuz. How did that all come together?
This is one of those scenarios where you would have thought an American president would have run through, in gaming out, if we do this, then what? And then what, right? All those if-then scenarios that you want to talk through when you're about to launch a major conflict. And to be fair, It is well reported that the military advisor to the President of the United States, General Kane, had cautioned that this wouldn't be clean and easy. Multiple combatant commanders from CENTCOM, including Frank McKenzie, who's a CBS contributor, have said, we looked at the Strait of Hormuz situation and gamed that out. So it's not fair to say that the military hadn't gamed out these scenarios. It's just whether it was calculated into the president's thinking, or maybe they overestimated or underestimated in some ways, overestimated the US force or underestimated the asymmetric warfare Iran was willing to play out. It's clear they underestimated what you're getting at, the power of Iran's drones and their ability to deploy them in a way that made it very expensive and complicated in some ways for the heavy defensive equipment the US put in our Gulf allied states to take down incoming missiles. A lot of the damage is from those drones. So you've seen a bit of a catch up having to take place here. And Iran did warn in their letters to the United Nations that they were going to treat those Gulf allies of the United States as fair game, fair targeting. They kept saying that.
I mean, Saudi has been hit and some refineries were hit in the past, but not nearly the way the UAE. What is it specifically about the UAE? Is there a pivot since the Abraham Accords that the UAE is looked at as the one wholeheartedly taking this deal from the United States and Israel and kind of the social compact of protection, or a bit of like a NATO type feel to the Persian Gulf? I was blown away by that. And it reminded me, this goes back to 2009. Maybe there was a WikiLeaks. There was a leak of a cable from Saudi that said that you have to decapitate the snake, which was Tehran. And that was all very hush hush. We know that they're in OPEC. We know that a lot of times it's a marriage of convenience, but there is a Sunni Shiite divide. But I don't see the upside in shelling someone like a UAE. How do you unring that bell? If you go back to some sort of normalcy, if there's a deal, you've absolutely poisoned the entire climate inside the Persian Gulf.
Well, right. And Qatar, which did trade with Iran, right? And to a significant amount, it was bombed, not just in this round, but back in June, remember? Okay. And that's how Iran responded to the US striking the military sites. So it's in some ways against their own interests if you assume there is a rational decision-making process. And that's where I find it's so useful to talk to people who spend a lot of time thinking about the Iranian regime and the nature of the IRGC and the fact that surviving is success. It's not militarily winning on the battlefield. It's surviving. It's the regime perpetuating itself. And so you do wonder at the end of this, I've asked these questions, frankly, of the Iranian Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi a few times on our program, saying, how can you possibly hold this position of, refusing to give up, for example, the right to enrich or so-called right to enrich when this is existential for you, but when your country will have itself just so devastated. And he can't move off that point because while he, as a diplomat, wants to make a deal, that harder right flank from the IRGC is now even more firmly in control than they were before this war. It's about the perpetuating themselves. And the IRGC, by the way, I was blown away by this when I went to Iran back in 2014 when I was a State Department correspondent for CBS. When you go to Tehran and you see that the IRGC, the Revolutionary Guard, is not just about exporting the revolution, they are a business. The IRGC owns the real estate. They have so many business interests. They have made a way forward by evading all the US sanctions. In fact, they find ways to profit off of it because they don't have to compete with private sector industry. So
construction, pistachios, cranes.
Somehow,
it's an absolute monopoly.
They've made, if you're thinking rationally, they've made isolation kind of work for them. So, it's just a different set of calculations.
But you talk about existential. So the very person you interviewed from Iran, what's to stop him from imagining if the negotiations don't go the White House's way, that he too will get eliminated? This is
exactly.
This is a real dystopian Orwellian. I don't understand. So if they don't like the interlocutors, they just take them out. There has to be a there. There has to be a counterfactual, a counterparty. Because I'm not trying to, preach sympathy or anything, but if the regime is toppled, people are going to get strung up. It isn't my impression that they're negotiating 747s full of planes to leave to Russia, full of lucre and everything else. It's pretty much you either get killed or you kill. and you hang on for dear life. It's that binary. And in addition to all the different wealth they have and all the different perks and the preferred admission and the premier tier of citizenship in Iranian society, I don't understand how you wrest that bone from the dog's mouth.
It's one of the reasons why I find it so fascinating to hear very different visions from the Israeli prime minister and the American president when they are supposed to have arms linked in this war, which is a joint operation, because the Israeli prime minister continues to talk about the Iranian people rising up and changing the regime. By definition, when you negotiate with the regime, you are throwing them a lifeline to remain in power. That's the U.S. current position. So if the U.S. position is we prefer to come to some kind of memorandum of understanding, whatever the terms are, and we'll give you X, Y, or Z in exchange for it, that is allowing the regime to continue to stay in place, which is Israeli definition. So I can't reconcile those. To be frank with you, the administration hasn't put forward someone to reconcile those views from the cabinet in a Sunday show capacity.
And is that Marco Rubio's remit? I'm always curious. I'm a fellow child of Miami, and it seems like he's decidedly responsible for the hemisphere, and namely whatever is going to happen in Cuba. But he has his property development. It's the two guys, his son-in-law and why do I forget the name already?
Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner.
Steve Witkoff, who was not trained. I mean, he's no Bill Burns or Madeleine Albright, but they're kind of doing it for a huge World War III type negotiation. You're not even getting. Are you seeing the dissonance between state and defense that you used to see in other administrations?
The current Trump administration functions like no administration I've ever covered before, including, by the way, the first Trump administration, which I covered up close as a White House correspondent, then as moderator of Face the Nation. There were far more conservatives in the first Trump administration than there are in the second. This is definitely the Republican Party that has been remade by Donald Trump, as embodied by, the personnel he has chosen. So it's very different from the General Jim Mattis as defense secretary, who found alliances important and the like.
Or even Rex Tillerson, CEO of Exxon. He knows these counterparties.
Right. This is totally different. And it is very transactional. And that's why you hear these conversations in a worried sense from our allies who say, well, if you don't value the way we've knit things together and worked in the past, because you understand the value, for example, of coordinating with your allies, then how really move forward if you're going to have these independent operators over here, which is basically how Steve Witkoff, the envoy, and Jared Kushner, the son-in-law, who doesn't officially work for the U.S. government, are functioning. It's interesting. Secretary Rubio would argue that it works very well for him and that it is efficient because he's also the national security advisor and he can't leave the president's side. So he farms out Russia and Ukraine to the Miami contingent of the State Department.
Isn't that amazing? That just blows my mind.
No, literally, like the Ukrainians are flying to Miami for the conversations because that's where they live. Witkoff and Kushner. And then on Iran, it's Witkoff and Kushner. On Gaza, it worked somewhat, right? We have this very tenuous, many would argue not really a ceasefire, but just sort of a status quo there right now that may be teetering because Hamas has not been fully disarmed and the Israelis have not withdrawn from Gaza. But at least they got the hostages back, right? They had a huge win there. And so based on that, they're trying to replicate it elsewhere. But these are very different scenarios. And what I find so interesting on the Iranian side was these were not very different individuals who were showing up to negotiate. The Ayatollah changes, the IRGC changes, but the negotiators are the same guys who were there back in 2015, who know this portfolio inside and out when it comes to the nuclear file, who know the sanctions inside and out when it comes to figuring out how to get some assets back for Iran. So they have that experience. And it informs what they're doing. So you always look at the two sides and wonder, is it liberating to not have any historical context or expertise, or what is it?
Before we go to break, the transactionalism that you think about, and Donald Trump has always been about the art of the deal and let's make a deal. And you can go back and look at these early 80s videos of the young, brash developer in Manhattan faulting the Carter and Reagan administration for its dealings with Iran and the embarrassment of the hostage crisis. And of course, you've spoken to many recent and former hostages. I have to ask, is there a potential from your sources are telling you for a grand transactionalist bargain on the table where you guys give up your missiles, Give us the dust, however many kilos of the dust it is. Stop with the regional tomfoolery or whatever they want to call it. And you can go off and be as corrupt and as, brutalitarian and nakedly capitalistic as you want. I mean, after all, the Chinese had to offer a social compact to their people after Tiananmen. Is there any indication that that's being offered behind the scenes to this regime? Just don't do regional terrible things like you did in the past. Give up your missiles, give up the dust, take the money and hang out.
That's where we were in February with early versions of a proposal that the Omanis were helping to put together. I had the Omani foreign minister on Face the Nation, an extraordinary interview because it's so rare for a mediator to sit down and talk about a conversation they're supposed to be sort of neutral on, right? Because they're facilitating it. And it was clearly, this was the day before the bombing began. And we knew there was a key meeting coming up at the White House later that afternoon. And it was clearly a Hail Mary with the Oman's top diplomat reaching out after I had been asking and saying, let's come on and talk. He thought there was the version basically of what you're talking about, which was, some sanctions relief here, some inspectors go in, they take the enriched uranium. That was being discussed, by the way. That's not new. It was on the table back then. But there are different ways you structure that. And it takes time. And he was asking for more time. And we went to bed, and then the next morning we wake up to bombing.
Full disclosure, stay with us. This show airs on NPR, Spotify. You can watch or listen to us on YouTube. We are on all the podcatchers. I put them all at one neat link for you, fulldradio.com. Again, fulldradio.com. A shout out to our radio listeners. We're on WVTF, Radio IQ across the great Commonwealth of Virginia. And hello to Charlottesville. Again, from Margaret, we are on WPVM in Asheville. You can catch us on KPPQ in Ventura, California. Holler if you too would like us on your air and catch me every week on both NPR's Here and Now and CNN. If you're just joining us, my esteemed guest is Margaret Brennan. She is, of course, host of Face the Nation. Every Sunday on CBS, she's covered the State Department. She's covered Wall Street, used to anchor Bloomberg TV, knows retail sales, can go toe-to-toe with a Fed chair. I've called you like either, an Inspector Gadget or turducken of journalistic coverage, which is why it's such a treat to always wonk out and go around the world with you. In all seriousness, I've asked this question of, is it Barak Ravid of Axios, a reporter you might know?
Yeah, he's great. He's a friend.
What was the leader of Hamas romancing before October 7th? What would the outcome be? Because clearly Gaza has been leveled, right? Whoever you talk to, the Witkoffs and others, it's going to take so many years to kind of take the munitions, the bodies to rebuild this thing, whether it becomes a resort, whether it becomes a DMZ type thing. Did he imagine that there would be this reaction from Israel, that there would be this regional conflagration? Or moreover, increasingly people are saying, or was it a long bet for public opinion to shift globally against Israel? I know that's a big question, but it really keeps me up at night, and I've always wanted to ask you.
To understand what was in Yahya Sinwar's head, the architect of the brutal attacks on October 7th, is kind of hard to do. I know what U.S. officials believe, both in this administration and the one prior, which was that Hamas had been quietly allowed to continue to rule and to govern and to grow inside Gaza, and that Israeli military and intelligence underestimated the amount of weaponry and money they had squirreled away. By the way, basically, with the tacit agreement with Israel, they'd be allowed to continue to exist. And they saw that there was this deal being brokered to normalize relations with the most significant Arab state, the most significant sort of leadership in the Muslim world in Saudi Arabia. And certainly the Biden administration, but I've also heard the Trump administration believe, and from Saudi officials, by the way, that the idea of normalization was something that was seen as existential, because if you have the Saudi government, the protector of the two holy mosques, saying, I'm going to give up on a Palestinian state and just normalize with Israel, then what is next for the Palestinian people? And that this was the desperate ploy to blow up that American brokered normalization.
But that in the short term, did he imagine that Hezbollah would follow through with a full volley of missiles, that Tehran would have his back? Like, how did he imagine it playing out? Did he imagine Biden not sending a tanker to the area, or not, or the administration effectively letting Israel do what it wanted to do. Was the long-term bet, and I know you have no way of going in his head, was the long-term bet global public opinion? In fact, United States public opinion. This is a huge problem right now for Israel.
It is a problem for Israel. It was a problem for Israel even before those attacks, but the overwhelming force and the devastation in Gaza and the, at times, indiscriminate, according to U.S. analysis, bombing that took the lives of many young children in particular because of the condensed population areas and the fact that Hamas hides in that 25-mile area within those population areas, permitted and allowed for even more mass killing. That and the imagery of it projected around the world has really not just galvanized public opinion in the United States in terms of the Democrats and Republicans, but it's a problem in the Arab street in some of these countries that already had normalized with Israel. Just within the past 24 hours, for example, I'm looking at the United Arab Emirates denying that their leader met with Israel's prime minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, a story that CBS broke. And why would the UAE then quickly come out and deny it? Well, because the prime minister is viewed as toxic due to the way he carried out that Gaza campaign, because of the phones that you have in your pocket with the screens on social media showing you the brutality of war close. I have heard multiple Arab leaders warn about how concerned they are that being an ally of the United States becomes more of a problem for them within their own country because the United States looks like it is, during the Biden administration and now during Trump, okay with it. Okay with our weapons being used in that fashion. But back to the early calculation on how it all play out, Israeli officials would argue that, and I've heard Israeli officials argue this to me, that Yahya Sinwar was believing that ultimately Tehran would enter the fray and that Hezbollah would as well, but that he acted on this plan ahead of time, too early, and the other parties weren't doing what he believed they would do. Ultimately, Hezbollah did enter the fray, but actually the Biden administration officials thought that Hezbollah was fairly restrained, even though they fired on northern Israel and the like, that they didn't follow through with their end of the deal, believing that the overwhelming force was not worth the risk. And it's interesting now, fast forward to the current conflict with Iran, that you did see Hezbollah respond to Iran's call after the U.S. and Israel began bombing Iran. They did that in March, even though the Lebanese government had passed a law saying it's only the Lebanese military that can act, not Hezbollah, really trying to disown them in a significant way from Beirut on down. And Hezbollah was seeing that dynamic shift, popular opinion going against them in their own country in Lebanon. So there's a lot of dynamics here.
And it beggars belief, and I don't mean to flog this, it absolutely beggars belief that Sinwar and his co-conspirators are there in these like hundreds of miles of tunnels using jury-rigged kind of copper wires to have conversations that couldn't be tapped. The IDF, Mossad places informants everywhere. And then October 7th happens with such extreme force and brutality and success from the perspective of Hamas. But then Israeli intelligence is the same that could take out a Hamas or Hezbollah figure in Tehran by infiltrating kind of the informant network there, or the beeper, pager bombings across Lebanon, that long con, which you guys have covered, I believe, on 60 Minutes. How do you have a world where both are true? It still blows my mind, and I still have not gotten over it.
No, it's all fair points, because, the war in Lebanon was rehearsed for. The war in Tehran was rehearsed for. Hamas and the Palestinian cause had been so sidelined and overlooked and downplayed. And this is one of the key questions that could be raised if there ever truly is a reckoning for Prime Minister Netanyahu in terms of his own people, right? You do have elections, but that sort of soul searching, what we could have done to spot this, something like I'm thinking America did after the 9/11 attacks or the 9/11 Commission. You haven't seen that happen yet fully in Israel. You are seeing them go from conflict to conflict now, right? Netanyahu argues that he has to overexert and reestablish deterrence to show military force now so that nothing ever happens again, in his argument. But you aren't seeing that self-analysis of, wait a second, was it this political decision by Netanyahu here or the Mossad leaders here, that decision, that pulling apart, that autopsy of sorts hasn't really happened yet. There's a reason you haven't settled it in your own mind. It hasn't been settled in real life.
Margaret, talk to me about OPEC and OPEC Plus and whatever is left of it. There are some unusual trade-offs which you have seen happen as this, we've had an energy crisis happen out this. This could not have happened 15 years ago prior to the United States having such dominance in the shale oil patch and natural gas, something approaching autonomy and self-sufficiency in energy that oil would have shot up to $200 crude nominally or whatever it is. And yet it still happened because of the Hormuz bottleneck. And yet while all that happened, UAE decides to say, I'm going to peace out. I'm getting out of OPEC. I'm not going to be beholden to the Saudis. I'm going to take prices up. You give a concession to the Russians to sell oil, which then keeps funding the Ukraine incursion, which is now however many years old, 5 years old? And then the Iranians, meanwhile, as we're talking about Trump visiting China today, are selling to these teapot refineries the Chinese crude, which just was like, whatever you give us, $30 discounts, $20 discounts, we'll take it and we'll refine it under cover of night. They really, for all the autonomy that the United States does have, this is ultimately held up by the price of oil and the price of gas.
Well, China doesn't have that domestic supply. They are looking for those outside suppliers, and that's where it is possibly a nerve for them. In the way that China has cornered the market on rare earths, the United States may have cornered the market on crude oil domestically, but it's a global trading place. So it's obviously
more. But it's also mother's milk for Iran and Kuwait. And if they can't get those shipments out, at some point, everybody cries uncle.
Yeah.
Like, do we go back to the status quo ex ante?
Definitely not. The Chevron CEO, Mike Wirth, was on Face the Nation recently. We were talking about, should the American people be thinking that we will go back to a February 27th scenario, right? Like before the U.S. and Israeli bombing of Iran began. Will prices revert there? Will business revert there? And he was laying out a scenario I understood to me that was far more complex. They weren't exactly shifting investment decisions yet, but that there would be a reexamination of some of that, he thought, in the energy space in terms of the refineries that were damaged in the Middle East. Some of them are going to take years to come back online. So it's not just the Strait of Hormuz, it's the actual capacity to create usable product that had been hurt. Talking about now this risk premium that needs to be repriced into the cost of oil because they've seen it is actually possible to close the Strait of Hormuz, or do we just go through different trading routes? So there is a massive shift that's changing, that's taking place in the energy space. One could argue certainly that maybe there's a theory of the case where there's more investment in other kinds of energy products as a result of this. But at this moment,
for example, heavy crude from Venezuela coming into the Gulf.
Right.
All of these things are related, which is really profitable and sustainable, not carbon wise, at $100 Brent, $100 a barrel Brent. So there might be this fantasy that if we flood the plain with enough cheap oil, it's going to cause all of these enemies to topple. But that's where I bring you back to this hemisphere. I know we don't have all the time in the world to do it, but then the Rubio agenda, this child of Miami, fellow Miami Dolphins fan. Trump was asked last week about the situation in Cuba. And when does that regime cry uncle after being in power since 1950? He says, I could just bring the USS Abraham Lincoln 100 yards offshore and they'll leave. It's fascinating. I mean, you could not have imagined it. I started off this conversation with that tableau of the ruler of Syria in the Oval Office, Trump taking out the ruler of Nicolas Maduro and running the place almost like a mercantilist gunboat diplomacy thing. And we're about to attempt that with Cuba while Hormuz is still very tense.
I know. I come back to the idea that this is an administration like no other, but it is also signifying a new America, or at least a new America as defined in the rest of the world's eyes, because you are not hearing an argument necessarily. Rubio does mention it, but here and there, that any of this is to preserve American values, export American values, right? All the things that the story we've told ourselves as a country from basically like World War II onward, the international global order, as President Biden would have called it. You don't hear that anymore from this administration. You hear more transactional items. And certainly in Latin America, that has been the argument as well. It's our backyard. There's just definitely a rationale for trying to, for example, chase out Chinese and Russian presence and investment there. We heard a lot about that before the Venezuela intervention. We also heard that Iran was in Venezuela and that Hezbollah had more of a presence there. It did for a long time, but we're not hearing that anymore. And by the way, what I am hearing from investors is that China and Russian investment are continuing in Venezuela. So the story has shifted again away from it's a drug cartel sort of, heaven, that it's also about human rights and democracy, which we kind of showed it wasn't, particularly by making the choice the United States did with that Venezuela intervention not to immediately back the democratically elected party that had won the prior election that had been stolen by Nicolas Maduro, right? It's Delcy Rodriguez, Maduro's number 2, that's in power there, not Maria Corina Machado and her party and the elected president who remains in exile. And I think there's a really interesting story here that has yet to be finished as we watch Secretary Rubio, because this has been his project. And beyond just the absolutely stunning military intervention in terms of the ability to carry out such a raid relatively flawlessly, you are seeing sort of a reworking of lessons learned from the Iraq intervention, not just from avoid boots on the ground, but allow for those very corrupt institutions, those very compromised ones, to continue to exist and slowly move towards shifting the state, but don't take it all out at once, because that can cause you more problems that you haven't necessarily built into your model. And that's the route that Secretary Rubio has gone, is do the opposite of what you did in the Iraq war, Republicans, and it might work for you in Venezuela. The question becomes, when does Marco Rubio leave the Trump administration? If he's running for president, should be sometime soon. Does he stay in these dual roles? And if it's not Rubio pressing for democratic elections in Venezuela, will they happen? Because it was that 3-point plan he laid out, right? That we would eventually get to democratic elections that could allow for those other political parties, like Maria Corina Machado's, to stand there. And by the way, it's shocking to me when I see those videos of the interior minister of Venezuela, the very same guy Maduro had in power, who has a $25 million bounty on his head still from the United States, who is the chief thug for Maduro, who helped run the prison system, sit across from the American interior minister and talk about mineral deals. It's extraordinary.
As you know, we did dirty things in Chile. We did dirty things in Argentina. There's the whole Kissingerian realpolitik school of thought. Under cover of night. I mean, there seems to be a return to that. Gunboat diplomacy, was that an early 20th century thing?
It was. I mean, with Cabello, Diosdado Cabello, this man in particular, I'm also fascinated because, by the way, he took out down in Miami in 2017 a contract on Marco Rubio's life. And I'm dying to see that meeting happen. Really want to be there to cover it when the two sit down together.
And I don't want to get deported for saying this. I am a naturalized citizen, but go read about what Marco Rubio was doing as a big Dolphins fan in 1985. I mean, it's amazing the arc you could take over 40 years. But before I close out with you, he was confirmed 99-0 in the Senate.
Yes. He has been pretty popular in Washington as the Secretary
that they
of State.
Thought he would be a foil to the impulses of his boss, who he has a love-hate relationship with?
I think that was the assumption. And he is the most trusted member of the administration when it comes to briefing his fellow, as a former senator, to brief his fellow lawmakers, but he is not necessarily at the helm of some of the big policy initiatives like Iran, like Ukraine and Russia, but he is very much at the helm of, as you pointed out, Cuba, that story that we haven't yet see fully play out.
In closing, I have to ask you, is Ukraine going to be Vladimir Putin's Afghanistan to the Soviet Union? I'm sure you get asked that at cocktail parties and CFR events and other things, but nobody expected this to drag on to be such a war of attrition for so long. And increasingly, articles in the Wall Street Journal about how irritated the Russian public, even though it can't be polled formally, that this wasn't supposed to take this long and be this embarrassing.
Yeah. And Vladimir Putin said just a week ago that perhaps this is coming to an end in Ukraine. I have heard from U.S. officials that, there are actual agreements in terms of the mechanics of how a ceasefire would work, but that's military to military. The security structures, there isn't the political decision, which goes back to Vladimir Putin's office in the Kremlin, to say we're going to cut our losses here. And the assessment has continued to be that Russia ultimately will continue as long as Vladimir Putin wants, that there isn't a real threat to his hold on power. So as frustrated as military generals might be, they're not likely to unseat him. And so it really comes down to him. And his call. And that's what's also fascinating about this structure the president has set up, where there are these continued meetings with Putin's investment advisor and counselor, Kirill Dmitriev, down in Miami with Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner. And you say, what are they talking about? What have they nailed down there? Because Dmitriev will leave and say they came to all these agreements on the economic front. So there's something that's being discussed, but we haven't yet seen any agreement to actually end the conflict, hand over, by the way, the thousands of Ukrainian children who were part of that state-sponsored kidnapping program that Vladimir Putin was not just sanctioned for, but there's an arrest warrant out for him because of it. And that is stunning to our European allies that there is somehow a decision to talk to him in a way that doesn't demand that certain things be a precondition, like handing back over Ukraine's children.
I mean, Putin did come to power, if I'm not incorrect, when the price of oil collapsed in the late 90s and Boris Yeltsin was teetering. You had this revanchist kind of, the Kremlin then co-conspired with oligarchs and everything to break up the company, and oil did recover. Oil is now back above triple digits, and that is mother's milk for Russia. That does buy them more runway in Ukraine. Indeed, CBS has reported the attacks in Kyiv today. Close us out. Close us out with something in your reporter's notebook that you think has gotten short shrifted, that you wish we had talked about, that you will be covering shortly.
Gosh, there's so much. We have an hour on Sundays, and I feel like we have like 20 hours worth of content and research and work to be covered every week on Face the Nation. We talk about all the domestic issues that we haven't touched on here, including the redistricting arms race that we're seeing between the two parties and states. I worry about the overall health of our democracy. When we talk about things changing globally, you might get lost in the details of some of these massive shifts in power, but you are seeing, I think, Americans question who we are in the world, how we function as a democracy. I look at the information environment that we are in. Obviously, we're participants in that information environment, but this change and the feedback loop to how our democratic process works, with people living in their own realities because they get siloed information sets. It's hard to come to any kind of big decisions on domestic policies when you can't agree on the basic facts. So for anyone who's saying, it's so surprising that the president in his second term is so dug in on foreign policy issues. Well, maybe these really thorny ones are easier than going and trying to get the two parties not just to work with each other, but to work within themselves, because you see these splits within the Republican Party, splits within the Democratic Party. The fact that people aren't even really tracking that there was a 76-day partial shutdown of Homeland Security because Democrats felt like that was the only chit they could play, and they demanded policy concessions they never got, by the way, after having shut down the government before that. We're not talking about lawmakers writing big new policies. We're talking about them not able to fund the government and pay the bills and come to agreement on that. There isn't a lot of dealing with America's big issues that's happening right now. And I think we shouldn't lose sight of that, because ultimately the health and strength of our democracy here helps the health and strength of our markets, of our economy, of everything that feeds into what makes us a global superpower. And I think Americans really need to think a lot more about that. And it's hard because we have to cover the frenetic nature of so many of these moments, news events, but that bigger picture of who are we, how stable are we, how are we dealing with each other, and how healthy is our democracy it's everything.
Face the Nation's Margaret Brennan, so grateful for you. I love your range of coverage. I love how you can volley every serve. Obviously, you're always welcome to come back on the show. If you could ever make time, we'll gladly have you.
Oh, thanks, Robin. Always good to talk to you.
Full disclosure, special thanks to Ian Stewart. If you are listening to us on the radio, note that while we cut for broadcast link, the entirety of every interview is on podcast. We are on the NPR network, Spotify, Apple. Watch us on YouTube. You could find them all at one link, fulldradio.com. Again, fulldradio.com. And please do recommend us to a friend. A shout out to our home station, WVTF Radio IQ, Virginia's NPR news source. DM me to carry us on your air, and catch me every week on both CNN and NPR's Here and Now. I'm Roben Farzad. Thank you for listening. Back with you next week.